October 25, 1944, aboard USS Enterprise in the Philippine Sea. Gunner's mate, Second Class Tommy Rodriguez, tightens his grip on the handles of a 40mm Bofors as General Quarters slices through the heavy, salty air. Over the carrier, a squadron of Japanese Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers streaks in the Navy's first coordinated suicide attack. They're coming, Rodriguez yells to his crew. The planes dive at better than 400 miles per hour, engines screaming as they fall toward the task force. Rodriguez tries to keep his gun on the lead bomber, but its speed and sudden maneuvers make it impossible to hold a steady aim. His simple ring sight tells him where the enemy is now, not where it will be when his shells arrive. He opens fire in rapid bursts, only to watch tracers sail harmlessly behind the plunging aircraft. All around him, shipboard anti-aircraft batteries roar, shells detonating in the empty sky while Japanese pilots close in. Unknown to Rodriguez, his ship carries a tiny but radical device, a shoebox-sized invention from a Massachusetts Institute of Technology professor with no military background, a piece of technology Navy leaders once dismissed as fanciful, which is poised to change naval air defense forever. The numbers are grim. In the first 2 years of the Pacific Campaign, American anti-aircraft weapons managed a hit rate of only about 3.2%. Roughly 3 enemy aircraft destroyed per 100 rounds fired. Japanese aviators attacked with near impunity, counting on speed and fortune to get through curtains of flak. By October 1944, U.S. ships had launched more than 400 anti-aircraft rounds in combat but recorded only around 12,800 hits, a catastrophic shortfall that left fleets exposed to increasingly desperate enemy tactics. The kamikaze phenomenon made the situation urgent. When pilots willingly crash their planes, every attacker effectively becomes a guided missile. Methods meant to frighten or deter attackers were worthless against men intent on dying, and standard gunnery doctrine began to crumble. Salvation, however, would come from Dr. Charles Stark Draper, an MIT engineer whose unorthodox ideas about fire control promised to transform aerial defense and would help spare thousands of lives in the war's final year. The fundamental difficulty hitting fast, maneuvering aircraft had vexed weapons designers since World War I. By 1941, USAA guns could launch rounds at very high speeds, but striking a fighter traveling several hundred miles per hour demanded mathematical precision beyond human capability. The core issue was lead calculation, deciding where to aim ahead of a moving target. A shell from a 40mm Bofors takes roughly 3 seconds to reach an aircraft at 4,000 yards. A plane cruising at 400 miles per hour can cover nearly 1,800 feet in that time. Gunners therefore aimed at vacant air and hoped the projectile and plane converged at the same spot. Ordinary ring sights only show current weapon alignment. Enemy planes rarely fly predictable, steady paths. They dive, climb, bank, and weave, producing a three-dimensional problem human reflexes struggle to solve quickly enough. The Bureau of Ordnance attempted fixes. Fire control directors, mechanical computers could compute lead angles but were bulky, fragile, and slow to adapt to abrupt target changes, making them ill-suited for shipboard use. Early automated trackers failed because contemporary technology couldn't reliably follow nimble targets. Many experts concluded the problem couldn't be practically solved. Admiral William Halsey summed up the skepticism in 1942. Anti-aircraft gunnery, he said, was more art than science. Machines could not be made to think like fighter pilots. The Bureau awarded contracts to familiar firms, Westinghouse, General Electric, and Ford Instrument Company, whose plans relied on massive mechanical calculators staffed by crews and needing constant upkeep. In real combat, these contraptions underperformed. Outside the shipyards, the stakes rose. The German Luftwaffe's precise bombing underscored the danger of air power, while Japanese naval aviators had already inflicted devastating damage at Pearl Harbor. Yet US vessels still lacked reliable air defenses. Their effective hit rates barely exceeded chance. The pattern of failure was consistent. Engineers applied conventional thinking, building intricate mechanical substitutes for human judgment that worked in tests but broke down in the chaotic, split-second reality of battle. By spring 1941, the crisis deepened. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant tonnage faster than it could be replaced. Japanese air power menaced U.S. positions across the Pacific, and ships carried anti-aircraft batteries that struggled to hit their marks. Lieutenant Commander Marion Murphy and the Bureau's Fire Control Section faced mounting pressure as time ran out and traditional methods reached their limits. Navy leadership, reluctant to recognize the full scale of the problem, clung to the belief that more training and more guns would suffice, overlooking the mathematical fact that human reaction and estimation cannot compute the three-dimensional intercepts required in modern aerial combat. That institutional inertia created a vicious cycle. Failing systems received further investment, while radical ideas were dismissed as impractical. Officers blamed gunners' skill rather than technological limits. The human toll became apparent in the war's early Pacific months. Japanese attacks exacted heavy damage, while American anti-aircraft defenses often proved ineffective, leaving sailors to watch enemy planes approach with a sense of helplessness. Cambridge, Massachusetts, May 1940. In the MIT faculty dining room, 38-year-old Charles Stark Draper's sleeves rolled up. Scribbling equations on a napkin has no formal military background, no weapons training, and no prior experience with naval gunnery. His specialty was precision instruments, a niche so technical that most naval officers couldn't have explained his work. Draper's odd academic path made him an unlikely figure to change the face of warfare. His doctorate focused on gyroscopic devices, instruments that detect rotation and orientation with extreme accuracy. While Navy designers labored over room-sized fire control machines, Draper tuned and tested spinning wheels, the diameter of coins. At MIT, he was regarded as an eccentric, brilliant mind who attacked problems from strange directions. Students called him Doc because he preferred tinkering and hands-on trials to abstract theorizing. His lab looked more like a machinist's shop than a university research room. Lathes, drill presses, and fine measuring tools crowded the benches. The key idea arrived over lunch with pilots and engineers from Sperry Gyroscope Company, who had been trying Draper's new rate of turn indicator, a compact gyroscope that let pilots know how quickly their planes were banking. A newspaper on the table blared news of German armor rolling through France, and the talk shifted to how their instruments might help on the battlefield. One pilot complained that anti-aircraft crews could hit a fixed object but failed against fast, maneuvering targets. Draper went quiet, looking at the turn indicator in his hand, and the connection clicked in his mind. If a gyroscope could measure rotational motion precisely, it might be used to anticipate where an aircraft would be, not just where it was. What if the sight could automatically aim ahead of the plane? He asked. The notion seemed fantastical, a mechanical device that predicted future positions, yet Draper saw the math lining it up. The gyroscope did not need to be clever. It merely had to be exceptionally accurate. Over the next weeks, he dove into the problem. He borrowed every text on ballistics and fire control he could find, filling his office with equations about trajectories, gyroscopic dynamics, and optical sighting. Rather than trying to supplant human intuition with heavy computation, Draper aimed to amplify it. Let the gunner continue to follow and fire, but have the sight shift the aiming point automatically to compensate for the target's motion. By September 1940, he had worked out the theory for a lead computing site that used a tiny gyroscope to sense how rapidly a gunner was tracking a moving target, and to offset the reticle to give the correct lead. The idea was so elegantly simple that conventional engineers had overlooked it, yet so transformative that it would alter aerial combat. It was late in the evening at MIT's instrumentation laboratory in September 1940 when Draper, alone in the basement among machine tools, set his crude prototype on the bench. The device, a metal box about the size of a shoebox, was clumsily wired to a .22 caliber rifle. Inside the box spun a coin-sized gyroscope at roughly 24,000 revolutions per minute, coupled to an optical system that threw a lit reticle onto angled glass. As a gunner tracked a moving object, the gyroscope would measure the movement rate and shift the sight so the aiming point led the target. Draper had been working nights and weekends for 6 months while still teaching. The project had no official backing from MIT or the military. That night, he mounted the modified rifle on a pipe stand and rigged a swinging towel as a makeshift target to mimic an aircraft crossing a gunner's view. The first shot missed badly. The sight was giving too much lead. He tweaked the gyroscope, fired again, and gradually closed the gap. For 3 hours, he fired single rounds, tweaking the mechanism after each miss. Bit by bit, the system improved until, by midnight, the shots consistently struck the moving cloth, a result nearly impossible with ordinary iron sights. The definitive moment came on his last shot. The towel swept by at an angle as if the mock aircraft were banking. Draper tracked smoothly and let the sight compute the lead. He pulled the trigger, and the bullet punched through the towel's center. He stared at the hole, astonished. His crude rig had automatically computed an accurate firing solution for a maneuvering target, something many military specialists had declared impossible. The following morning, he took the prototype to space. Their engineers greeted the rough construction with skepticism. "This looks like something you built in your garage," a chief engineer scoffed. "I did build it in my garage," Draper replied. Closer inspection revealed the refined precision hidden beneath the rough casing. The mathematics were sound and the test evidence persuasive. When Draper demonstrated the device to military officials, however, the reception was hostile. "This is completely insane," a Navy ordnance officer declared. "You want to put a spinning top on a gun and expect it to hit aircraft? Impossible." Laughter and derision filled the room, but Draper remained unshaken. He had seen it work. On May 28, 1941, Lieutenant Commander Marion Murphy escorted Draper through the Bureau of Ordnance's corridors in Washington, D.C., past rooms full of blueprints and models of massive fire control gear, toward a meeting that would decide whether Draper's site would be adopted or consigned to oblivion. 12 high-ranking naval officers and civilian engineers fill the conference room. The Navy's top technical thinkers are all present. Captain William Blandy, who heads the Bureau of Ordnance's Research and Development branch, sits at the table's end. His backing is the one Draper needs. "Gentlemen," Murphy says, "Dr. Draper has built a gyroscopic sight that automatically computes lead for moving targets. It weighs under 20 pounds and needs no external power." Captain Ralph Christie, the Bureau's fire control authority, immediately balks. Lead computing sites, he points out, have always been huge mechanical machines that require teams to run. How could a 20-pound box possibly do the same work? Draper carefully sets his rough prototype on the table. The unimpressive metal case draws skeptical glances. "It doesn't calculate," Draper replies softly. "It measures. The gyro senses how fast the gunner is turning to follow a target and shifts the sight so the reticle provides the correct lead." Objections explode around him. A Westinghouse engineer scoffs that lead solutions need exact data on speed, altitude, and bearing, things a simple gyroscope can't deliver. A representative from Ford Instruments argues, "The system depends on steadiness of operators and won't replace human error with machine reliability." Captain Christie pounds the table, reminding everyone of the millions poured into proven fire control machinery and decades of engineering behind the large mechanical computers. Draper listens without argument. He has met expert resistance before and knows novel concepts often provoke dismissal. "Would you like to see it work?" he asks. Silence follows. Nobody expects much from the homemade device. 2 days later, the same crowd gathers at the Watertown Arsenal firing range. Draper bolts the modified .22 rifle to a stand, while Murphy runs a mechanical target carrier that drags panels across the range at varying speeds and angles. The first target, a white panel moving left to right at about 30 miles per hour, appears. Draper shoulders the rifle, follows the panel through his gyroscopic sight, and fires. The bullet punches the panel's center. A ripple of astonished murmurs passes through the observers. Again, Captain Blandy orders. The next target moves faster and around. Draper tracks, lets the sight compute the lead, and scores another direct hit. By the 5th consecutive hit, skepticism has flipped to excitement. Captain Christie leans in, inspecting the sight. "Explain it," he asks quietly. Draper lays out the physics. The gyro records angular velocity, the rate the gunner pivots to track the target, and because that angular rate directly corresponds to the needed lead angle, the sight can present the proper aiming point without measuring range or true target speed. Captain Blandy makes the decision that alters naval gunnery. He asks for specifications and pricing for 50 experimental units, noting that if the demonstrations hold, the Navy will eventually want thousands. Officers and engineers cluster around the prototype, peppering Draper with technical questions and discussing how to implement the idea. Fleet Lieutenant Horatio Rivero, once Draper's student at MIT, approaches with obvious admiration. "Doc, you just solved the toughest problem in naval gunnery," he says. Within 24 hours, the Navy places an initial order for 12 experimental Mark 14 sights. The device, once ridiculed as impossible, is now slated to appear aboard major ships. At the Naval Proving Ground in Virginia, on January 15, 1943, Commander Arthur McDonald supervises an exhaustive weapons trial. Technicians install the first production Mark 14 sights on 40mm Bofors mounts, and the resulting statistics will decide whether Draper's invention becomes standard issue. The testing regimen is exacting. Radio-controlled targets fly set courses at different speeds, heights, and approach angles, while gun crews fire measured bursts. Electronic counters tally every round and every successful hit to produce precise performance metrics. Baseline trials with ordinary iron sights showed 12,847 rounds fired and 412 targets struck at 3.2% success rate. Trials with Mark 14 gyroscopic sights, record rounds, fired 1,123 and 1,527 hits, yielding a 10.1% success rate. The improvement is striking, more than triple the effectiveness of conventional sights. And individual gun crews show rapid gains. With the Mark 14, the men concentrate on smooth tracking while the sight supplies the math. Gunner's mate first class, Joseph Romano, sums up the difference from the old days. "Before I was guessing where to lead. Half the time I overshot. Half the time I fell short. With the Mark 14, I keep the target on the reticle and squeeze the trigger. The sight does the thinking." By June 1943, production Mark 14 units begin reaching the Pacific Fleet, and their first combat trial comes during the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. On November 20, 1943, off to Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Mike Sullivan crouches at his 40mm Bofors as the carrier's radar warns of inbound Japanese aircraft. Betty bombers climb to about 15,000 feet before diving, accelerating above 350 miles per hour toward the American force. Bogies inbound, bearing 270. The gun director calls. Sullivan trains his mount and peers through the Mark 14's illuminated reticle. which automatically shifts as he tracks the diving attacker. When the lead aircraft reaches roughly 4,000 yards, Sullivan opens up. His tracers streak ahead of the plane, exactly where the sight predicts it will be. The bomber detonates in the air, flaming wreckage falling into the sea. "Got him?" Sullivan shouts, already turning on the next threat. Within 15 minutes, the task force has downed 11 Japanese planes while only suffering minor damage to a single destroyer. The reversal in kill rates marked a dramatic turnaround from earlier battles when Japanese pilots slipped through American flak with disturbing regularity. The clearest demonstration of the Mark 14's power arrived during the kamikaze strikes in the Philippines. On October 25, 1944, aboard USS Enterprise, gunner's mate, second-class Tommy Rodriguez, the sailor from our opening scene, now mans a 40mm Bofors fitted with Draper's gyroscopic sight. As enemy dive bombers plunge toward the carrier in the first organized suicide attack, Rodriguez keeps the lead attacker centered in his Mark 14. The gyroscope instantly computes the proper lead, as the kamikaze plummets at about 400 mph. He tracks steadily and fires. His rounds meet the incoming plane at roughly 2,000 yards, destroying it before it can reach the deck. All around him, crews using Mark 14 sights score similar hits. What might have been a catastrophic blow to the task force instead becomes a lopsided loss for the attackers and only light damage to American ships. The numbers are striking. During the Philippine campaign, 1,947 kamikaze aircraft were engaged. Ships equipped with Mark 14 sights accounted for 10,452 of the shoots. Danze reported success rate of 78.6%. Intercepted Japanese traffic confirms how profound the shift was. Commander Yoshio of the 343rd Naval Air Group warns superiors that American defensive fire has become terrifyingly accurate. Pilots report that enemy tracers now meet their aircraft with mechanical precision. Veteran ace Saburo Sakai notes that American shells seem to arrive where their planes will be, not where they are, as if their gunners could see the future. Admiral Tokijiro Onishi, head of Japanese naval aviation, issues the grim appraisal that American ships are becoming nearly impossible to attack, with anti-aircraft effectiveness approaching theoretical limits. Every approach to US vessels now risks guaranteed destruction. The change matters on a human level as well as a statistical one. Sailors who once watched helplessly as enemy planes bore down now feel defended. Seaman First Class Robert Hayes of USS Franklin writes home that they no longer feel powerless. The guns work now. He tells his family, when we shoot at them, they go down. It's like having a guardian angel over every ship. If this tale of ingenuity hooks you, subscribe and turn on notifications to follow how this MIT professor's device saved thousands of lives and helped win the war. By the conflict's end, the Mark 14 had been produced in huge numbers, over 85,000 units supplied to American and British guns, and the device that skeptics once deemed impossible produced kill rates that outstripped pre-war expectations, converting anti-aircraft defense from guesswork into reliable mathematics. On August 15, 1945, as General MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, virtually every major U.S. warship there carried multiple Mark 14 sights. The final tally underscores Draper's impact: about 85,000 Mark 14 units manufactured, 23,147 enemy aircraft destroyed, and an estimated 50,000 American lives saved. Post-war studies concluded that ships outfitted with Mark 14 sights achieved anti-aircraft kill rates roughly 15 times higher than vessels using conventional methods. The transformation owed to a deceptively simple mechanical principle. A tiny gyroscope turned an unreliable, frantic defense into a precise, lethal system. Veterans provide the most powerful testimony. Lieutenant Commander Frank Smith of USS Hornet wrote that the Mark 14 gave his crew a confidence they had never known. Knowing they could stop approaching attackers mattered as much as the technical gains. Gunner's mate, First Class Joseph Romano, paid the warmest tribute. Draper never set foot on a warship, never fought in combat, and never wore a uniform, yet his invention brought thousands of sailors home. Draper himself stayed modest, deflecting praise to the Navy personnel who employed his device. "I simply solved a mathematical problem," he told interviewers, insisting the real heroes were the young men at the sites. He turned down endorsements, publicity, and film offers, returning to MIT to pursue new work in precision instruments. Wartime fame became an embarrassment he quietly avoided. The Mark 14's legacy extended beyond the war. Draper's gyroscopic ideas became central to inertial navigation. His post-war research helped guide missile systems and the navigation computers that powered the Apollo program. And descendants of his designs steer modern Trident submarines. Today's head-up displays and stabilized targeting systems trace conceptual roots to that shoebox prototype he tested in a basement. The larger lesson is about perspective. Draper solved what experts had declared impossible by approaching the problem differently. His unconventional background let him see a solution conventional weapons engineers missed. As a colleague, Riley put it, He didn't know the automatic lead problem was supposed to be impossible, so he built it anyway. He sought no glory or profit. His reward was the lives saved and the systems that continue to protect and navigate long after the war ended. Asterisk.